Clinical psychologist Dr. Dawn Hughes took the stand this morning on day 8 of the Diddy trial in an effort by the state to try and explain to the jury some of the conflicting testimony that they may have perceived from Cassie Ventura. And Cassie is one of the state's alleged sex trafficking victims, courtesy of defendant Sean Puffy Combs, and her testimony was designed to help the jury better understand why it is that she seems to express so much love for Diddy, while purportedly being coerced into behavior against her will. I'm Joe Neerman, aka Good Logic. I'm an attorney down the courtroom. I'm covering this trial every single day. If you want more attorney perspectives as to how this trial is proceeding, I urge you to please make sure you like, share, subscribe, hit the bell so you get all notifications as I drop 2 videos a day, in addition to doing a live stream at night where I go into much greater detail as to what we saw earlier that day. Now, Dr. Hughes came up and said that she wanted to address 4 different areas as to how trauma victims will react to that trauma, and specifically addressing why someone who's a victim and a long-term victim of domestic violence would stay in that abusive relationship, as well as how they cope with that abuse, how they end up expressing it and disclosing it, and how it affects their memory. And the objective here, again, was to try and help the jury better understand what's going on. She's in this abusive relationship, according to her testimony, on and off for 11 years and keeps going back. As Dr. Hughes explained, and beneficial from the state's perspective, ended up using language that Cassie herself used during her testimony when she was when Dr. Hughes was expressing how a typical long-term sufferer of domestic violence will tend to act. Now, Dr. Hughes never conducted any interviews of Cassie, never spoke with her. She's what they call a blind expert, in that she looks at different reports and tries to gather what she sees going on in the news about this story, much like any of you may be following what's going on in the news, and tries to get an overall picture. But this is not Cassie's specific psychologist. She's never sat down and met with Cassie at all. She's talking in general as an expert who understands how a typical domestic violence sufferer would react to that trauma. And she said that, and she expressed in exceeding detail exactly why it is that someone would stay in that abusive relationship, how they're looking to recapture what they saw in the past, different methods that they use to try and cope and deal with that abuse, and the justifications that they use. She talked about minimization, how the victim will usually often not disclose it with anyone for a myriad of reasons, such as shame or embarrassment, fear of not being believed. And she talked about that, how the abuser tends to act in these relationships, and a lot of it seemed very consistent with testimony that we heard from Cassie. She talked about using financial power in order to try and keep that person feel physically under your control. He talked about how they may threaten and engage in emotional abuse, try and make the person feel lesser than, try and make them feel, strip them of their independence by making them feel that they need this other person, both financially and also to try and reclaim the respect and admiration that they got during the honeymoon phase of the relationship. And that there's a continual effort to try and get back to that honeymoon phase, and a hope that if they can try to find a way to manage the situation, that they will succeed in coming back to the good periods, the good times. But that throughout the time, part of their coping methods is that they act like someone who has PTSD, and they're walking on eggshells. So much of the testimony was very consistent with language that Cassie was using. For example, she talked about how they get stripped of their agency, of their ability to feel independence. And one of the things that we heard Cassie talk about when she was asked whether she would trade the money to have not lived through these experiences, the language that Cassie used is, "I would give anything back to get back my agency," which, when she said it, I thought was an unusual choice of words. But in the context of the fact that she has received a great deal of therapy to try and cope with the impact of her extended or her purportedly extended abuse at the hands of Diddy, you can understand why that's a language that would come back to her, that she's been trying to reclaim her agency. Dr. Hughes went on to explain how they will frequently go back to the abuse, and that the effort in going back is that they feel that it's not working, that if they try to get away, that they never can get away, that it's an impossible situation to get free of. And that is consistent with Cassie's language, that she said, how do you get out of a situation like this? How do you do that? She talked about how there will frequently be gaps in memory, that when the person is trying to recall it, there may be certain things that will be very vivid, and central parts of the story will be there, but that often they might focus on one particular thing, either because they're trying to become dissociative and they're trying to just zone out on something, and that could be something that's intentionally that they're doing, and they'll just remember what color the drapes were and how they were fluttering in the midst of being abused, because it's their way of leaving their body and dissociating. And when she talked about dissociating, you would think that the jury would likely call back to when Cassie frequently testified how that she would take drugs to try and become dissociative, to try and not actually be in her body while she was going through those freak-offs that she purportedly went through hundreds of times. So the tracking of language between Cassie's testimony and the typical domestic violence victim, that tracking of language seemed to run throughout the testimony, and it didn't seem that she actually even watched the trial. It seemed as if that everything that Cassie had been saying seems almost textbook from what Dr. Hughes has experienced. She's a 30-year board-certified clinical psychologist, and you'd have to think that she made significant strides in the state's effort to try and help the jury better understand why it is that she still seems to be expressing love. As Dr. Hughes explained, she said years after they leave, they frequently will still have a sense of love, and she talked about a trauma bond being that through the course of going through that trauma, and their efforts to cope with it and to try and recover that honeymoon phase will make them feel in certain ways a stronger sense of love than other people in a healthier relationship. So all of this is designed to convey to the jury that the testimony that they heard from Cassie, which may have sounded conflicting and confusing to many of us as to why she's doing what she's doing, why would you keep going back, and that might have led to questions about her credibility, the state was certainly trying to lay that to rest by showing how, from everything Dr. Hughes was testifying, that seems consistent with a classic long-term sufferer of domestic violence. Now, we had just begun cross-examination when we broke for lunch, and I certainly plan on reporting back to you in the afternoon session what dents that Agniflio is able to make in Dr. Hughes. He seems to be working very methodically in his cross-examination as far as how she reaches her conclusions and what steps she takes in order to make her assessments. And I certainly will plan on reporting back to you on that at the close of trial today, and again giving you a much more detailed breakdown this evening. I hope you'll join me for that. Please make sure you click like, share, subscribe. I'm Good Logic. Till next time, Godspeed.